Good day, everyone, and welcome to this Yale Center Beijing Zoom talk. I'm Carolee Rafferty, the Executive Director of Yale Center Beijing. In collaboration with the Yale Club of Hong Kong and the Yale Club of Beijing, today we are super delighted to have Brian Wong, a Rhodes Scholar and Assistant Professor in Philosophy at the University of Hong Kong, and George Chen, a Yale World Fellow and Managing Director for the Asia Group, for a discussion on understanding geopolitics at the Crossroads, and loosely based on Brian's latest book, 地缘风云, the Era of Geopolitics. This evening will go as follows. George will moderate this approximately hour-long talk about Brian's latest book, which Brian very impressively completed during his stays at Oxford University, among multiple books, where he shared his observations and insights on the role of Hong Kong and U.S. China relations, the evolving landscape of geopolitics, and the significance of acquiring knowledge in this field, whichever sector you work in. After their conversations, we'll then open up the floor for Q&A. A brief introduction about each of their backgrounds. Brian holds a DPhil in politics, an MPhil in political theory with distinction, an MA in philosophy, politics, and economics at University of Oxford. As a columnist at the Hong Kong Economic Journal, Xinbao, an editor-at-large for Thrive Global, he writes prolifically on Chinese foreign policy and Sino-West relations for publications such as Time, Foreign Policy, Financial Times, Fortune, you name it. And according to George, and I know from other people as well, he's very well read by leaders such as Hong Kong's Chief Executive, John Lee. George Chen is a Yale World Fellow. He's a practitioner and scholar with over 2 decades of expertise across media, technology, and public policy, although I'm sure you can't tell it, but for his slightly graying hair. He was Meta's Facebook first ever and most senior policy leader for Greater China, Mongolia, and Central Asia in both editorial and management roles at leading media organizations such as the South China Morning Post and Reuters. He's currently a doctoral candidate at the University of Hong Kong. He earned his Master's of International and Public Affairs with distinction from Hong Kong U, with a concentration on the strategic triangle of U.S., China, and Taiwan relations. He's also a visiting scholar at National Chengchi University in Taipei. Although we've marketed this as a kind of versus Rhodes Scholar versus Yale World Fellow, we're doing this in a very collegial way, and I know we're in for a fascinating conversation. So without further ado, let's welcome Brian and George. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Carol.
Carol.
Thank you, Carol. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, everyone. I know this is exactly dinner time in Beijing, and we probably also have audience from the rest of the world. So thanks for your interests. To delay or skip your dinner time to join the conversation with us. To talk about geopolitics. Brian has been my friend for many years. He also spent many years at Oxford. Finally he graduated. With the Oxford PhD, and then he just joined the HKU as assistant professor in the philosophy department. I also need to do a bit of promotion for Brian. Although he just joined the HKU, but he already helped to launch the program called the AI and Ethics. It's a master program. If anyone's interested, go to the HKU website. They got a pretty packed class for this year. This is the first year, but I heard, I understand they will continue to recruit, for the next year. So it will be fun, AI and ethics. But this is not a topic, we want to address today. We will, talk about the geopolitics. The reason is, as Carol mentioned, Brian published a new book I don't know if you have an English name, official name, but anyway, in Chinese it's 地缘风云. Partly because Brian is also a columnist for one of the most read business dailies in Hong Kong, Hong Kong Economic Journal, 信报. So of course, he's been writing the columns for many years, during his time at Oxford. As Carol indicated, there are a lot of VIPs among Brian's audience. So I think Brian thinks it's a great idea, to put the columns together, and of course, to also rewrite some chapters, to have a book about geopolitics. This is not a book for like a PhD students, to study. It's very easy to read. There are a lot of stories. You and I will, hear about, in the real world. So this is, perhaps, my first question. I can start, the conversation now, with Brian. So a lot of people will say, well, geopolitics, why should we study it, for ordinary people, right? This, we can leave this to policy experts. Why, is there a really a need, and like for not for people like you and me, for people who don't really study politics to also understand a bit geopolitics. What are the benefits, for people to read your book and to know a bit more about geopolitics, right?
Thank you very much. And thank you, George. And thank you, Carol and the Yale team for having me here. I just want to start by perhaps by offering a preamble to our discussion today and answering indirectly first what you said, George, concerning, why geopolitics and why individuals in relation to learning about geopolitics. And I posit that the answer is rather straightforward, which is that, like it or not, geopolitics, unfortunately, is here to stay and is likely to affect us. From the visa bans directed towards ordinary civilians merely suspected of having an affiliation with the ruling party, I'm talking about American bans towards Chinese citizens, through to allegations of espionage and charges of interference levied towards ethnic Russians in the UK and in Europe, to indeed the shifting of the world towards an increasingly ideologically oriented, less about money, less about trade, less about doing business, and more about all of these incredibly fractious and wrought abstract claims of religiosity, of partisanship, and of identity politics. All of these phenomena happening around us today are indicative of one thing, that there's no escape from politics and its ever-present effects. And that was also one of the primary motivations, right, which got me thinking about this book. Because the very original conception of this, when I was discussing with Alice Kwok, who's a dear friend and an esteemed mentor, who's currently the editor-in-chief for the Hong Kong Economic Journal, we were essentially discussing, the past few years of events have, affected and taken to us in Hong Kong, but also by and large ethnic Chinese folks living in China, living abroad, in a world at large. There's no escape from politics, even if we were to say, I don't want to touch politics, I don't want to touch ideology, I'm not interested, and getting bogged down and embroiled, it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, there's always a way for politics to come find you. So the first point I want to make here is I was driven to really put together a guide. It's almost like a survival guide, kind of like a how to survive a zombie apocalypse. But in this case, it's how to survive a post-globalization, increasingly I guess a pre-geopolitical tension, this state of complete confusion, this dusk of the old order and the dawn of a new order. How can we defend our own interests and keep ourselves safe? And by that, that also means, by the way, keeping our families and friends and loved ones safe. So that was really the motivation undergirding that. And secondly, just very quickly, there's often this thought that geopolitics should be relegated and consigned to the realm of politicians, diplomats, statesmen, so on and so forth. And yet, as we've seen in the likes of Donald Trump, Bolsonaro, Marine Le Pen in France, this is an era where statesmen and politicians are no longer behaving as they really should be, where the common interest and the public interest have been sacrificed and thrown under the bus by those who are precisely elected with the original purpose of purportedly serving the public. And if indeed our statesmen and our diplomats and our politicians are not living up to their end of the bargain, then it's high time, I thought, that we found our own space and our own devices as a recourse, as a solution to much of the melee. We can no longer count upon the leaders and our governments in charge in positions of power to fend our interests. And that is also why, in part, I wrote the book. So thank you very much for that great question, George.
Thanks, Brian. Now everybody can tell you are a truly Oxford alum, based on your strong Oxford, British accent. But anyway, yes, I very much agree. I think geopolitics now, matters to everyone, no matter which industry you are working in. I spend a lot of time in the tech industry, and I can prove, technology is not just about the advanced technologies, right? If you think about how the internet is governed, that's very much geopolitical, challenging these days. You mentioned the globalization. We will come back to that topic. But before that, I think in our normal life, even if you just read the media headlines, you will always come up, catch up with terms like a G20, G7, G2, and obviously, G2 nowadays refers to U.S. and China. And some people will say, well, forget the geopolitics. At the end of the day, it's just like two big nations. If China and U.S. can get along, the world will get better. If not, and then affect everyone, do you agree? Like we are kind of like coming towards the two pillars rather than multi-polar world, and what does that mean to smaller countries if you are not like in the US and China?
Thank you very much, George. Again, an important question. You mentioned G2, G77, G10, G8, so on and so forth, or G7. These are all acronyms, but yet for the sake of clarity, I guess, let's hone in on the notion of G2 in particular, because if you were to ask me if I thought we were living in a G2 world today, I'd say this. I broadly believe that the world is becoming increasingly bipolar, but bipolar in an unequal and uneven manner. And that is to say that the United States remains by far ahead of China when it comes to, firstly, economic might and wherewithal, although the gap is closing quite rapidly there. Financial prowess with regards to being the dominant currency and a global reserve currency. The gap is closing somewhat, but we've got a long way to go before China could achieve any semblance of parity with America there. And finally, when it comes to the military and also to a lesser extent the soft power dimensions, I'd say China still has a fair bit of catching up to do. So in short, there is an asymmetry in power between the United States and China. And to some friends of mine who are incredibly confident and trenchant when they say, yes, China has now surpassed America, we've now overtaken America, I'd say, well, I appreciate your optimism, but your sanguine attitudes may not necessarily reflect what is in fact the reality. And that happens with a lot of things in life. So we have to recalibrate our expectations. With that said, what I'm more concerned about is that whilst we are living in a bipolar world, that neither the United States nor China is perhaps stepping up to the mantle of global governance, and therefore leaving the space open for the onset of the Kindle-Burger trap, e.g., a state where no single government or no single power in the world is willing to step in and step up to provide for the public goods that the world needs. And in the context of the 21st century, that includes, for instance, climate change related adaptation and mitigation measures and means that many in the global south and the developing countries in the world do not have access to. That also includes regulations, frameworks that allow us to make sense of risks and potential opportunities to be gained from, technology such as artificial intelligence and also advanced forms of biotech and cybergenetics. And finally, in face of global pandemics and food crises, epitomized no better than perhaps by the recently concluded, or some would say still ongoing, COVID pandemic, right? It is vital that we have a global response, a coordinated, again, collaborative response to these issues. And yet, precisely because of the increasingly fractured and fractious relations between Beijing and Washington and the state of what I call mutual strategic mistrust and threat perception that we see both powers as locked in today, there's this worry that I have, and I don't know if you agree with me, George and Carol and everyone else, that our world is trending towards and sleepwalking into disaster without our taking note of it, because we're too busy talking about political disagreements, Sino-US spats, acrimony between different leaders. Now, that's something I'm quite concerned about. But if there is indeed a silver lining that I can see on the horizon, it'd be the rise of locally and regionally prominent power centers, the likes of India, the European Union, ASEAN, right there in Southeast Asia. These are all regions and countries that, whilst on their own, may not be able to push back adequately against the bipolar world order, nor do they have any incentives to, because they want to, many of them play these two powers off against one another. But individually, in their own ways, in their respective regions, they are playing, to some extent, an effective role in curbing the excesses of both Beijing and Washington's desire for countries to take sides. And I would posit that this desire for countries to choose their allegiances, declare their allegiances, is particularly evident coming from Washington. Sure, China might say, you've got to join the Belt and Road Initiative, buy into our vision of a shared future of common destiny, and support our global security, development, and civilization initiatives. But at the end of the day, China knows that it can't afford to force countries to choose sides, because once it does that, it will lose. No country, very few countries rather, I'm sure there's some, would want to exclusively take the side of China against the United States, despite all the valid grievances that many of them could well harbor towards the US. If you take Saudi Arabia, for instance, a country that Joe Biden openly lambasted and promised to convert into a pariah state, Saudi Arabia is no fan of the kind of hubris and ideological supremacism on display from Washington. And still, nevertheless, we see Saudi Arabia actively engaging and responding to America's invitation for it to participate in a sort of expanded version of the Abraham Accord. So in short, I would posit that what we're seeing here today is an even bipolar world with a lot of regional clusters and powers, and yet global governance remains a sore point of that is quite frankly lacking and wanting in a status quo.
I do want to share one more like a realistic example to show if we talk about geopolitics just from G2 perspective, how realistic the challenge is facing all of us. Brian, you mentioned the world is definitely trading into a more dangerous direction, and sorry for a bit self-promotion. Brian and I recently co-authored an op-ed about why the US and China should collaborate rather than like decouple in the aspect of AI, right? Maybe Brian, you can share a little bit. I just want to use the AI. It's a hot topic as an example. To for you to explain more about how geopolitics works. In the aspect of technology and what the risks are. If we don't get along with each other, especially among the big countries. I'll also share the link in the chat box with the audience.
Thank you, George. A mentor of mine once quoted the Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, saying that, if the Ukraine war is the last and one of those dreadful wars of the 20th century, even though it's happened, it is happening in the 21st century, then any potential showdown between China and America over any insert region of potential conflict could well be the first 21st century, bona fide 21st century war, because this is going to be a war that could well involve artificial intelligence, with China and America both being AI superpowers. I'm paraphrasing from a very popular book penned recently, on AI and AI capacities of both parties. And there's not going to be a winner. No one's going to win from a showdown between China and America that goes kinetic, that goes, and turns into a hot war involving artificial intelligence. And that's largely because of the innate characteristics of AI. It is incredibly rapid in its processing speeds and calculation abilities. It is expansive in the volume of data it has access to at its ready disposal. It is capable of imitating, replicating, even surpassing humans with regards to what we call broadly intelligent behaviors. And whilst we're by no means at the point of artificial general intelligence just yet, but what had previously seemed to be impenetrable and frankly impossible, right, AGI, it is no longer that distant and far away from us as we speak today. We can see that from the trajectory of evolution when it comes to generative AI, right, with the GPT 1, 2, 3, 4, and then so forth. You can also see that with regards to the rise of civilian and military dual usages of AI when it comes to identifying faces and targets, algorithm based sorting and allocation of resources, and even just the prospects of AI and algorithm-fueled hacking campaigns that interfere with the digital and also physical infrastructure of different countries. All of this is to say that I think whilst analogies between nuclear weapons, or more specifically nuclear non-proliferation and AI regulation, I don't think these analogies quite stand, given the difference in terms of the barriers to entry, accessibility, and also decentralization vis-a-vis AI ownership and usage. There is nevertheless an element of congruence between the two, which is that both nuclear weapons and artificial intelligence, especially when militarized, could yield devastating consequences. Devastating consequences that are irreversible, that cannot be repaired, cannot be contained, cannot be managed once the cat's proverbially out of the bag. And that is if China and America are indeed insistent on heading towards this conflict, if America is indeed so adamant that China's rise must be inhibited at any cost, and that China does not find a way to work around that sort of grand strategy advanced by the morphing and emerging consensus in DC, if indeed all of these ifs were to materialize, and I fear that the questions we should be asking then isn't which cities would or would not be bombed, but which cities can remain immune from the digital wipeout, annihilation, and all but certain guaranteed, destruction of the coordination capacities on a part of government. So I think, just right off the bat, the biggest tail end risk really when it comes to Sino-American tensions is an AI showdown, not just a nuclear war, and indeed nuclear wars might be less likely due to the commonly accepted and ingrained understanding, right, of mutually assured destruction with regards to nuclear weapons. But on the front of AI, that's where I fear that our flippancy and our complacency would lead us towards Armageddon. And furthermore, on a more positive note, there's much that Beijing and Washington can learn from one another when it comes to AI development, governance, and regulation. China stands to gain from America's involvement of the private sector and also cognizance of the strengths and unique talents of, firms such as OpenAI, Microsoft, so on and so forth, in cultivating their own arsenal of AI capabilities. The private sector is not always, to use a Chinese phrase, 洪水猛兽. They're not necessarily beasts that must be reined in, so to speak. And yet, of course, America has a danger of going down, the other end of extremity, right? And essentially seeking to over-restrict private sector, or rather over-restrict regulations against the private sector, and to be excessively permissive towards the private sector. And here I would recommend that we look at China's, pretty extensive and comprehensive generative AI regulations that were just rolled out last month, based on a working document that was circulated towards the end of Q1 this year concerning generative AI. It's clear that the State Council in China is thinking about AI and its implications and the dangers of it on misinformation, on non-alignment, and other forms of undesirable usages of AI should it fall into the wrong hands. So I think America could afford to really look, and take seriously what the Chinese government is putting out there and try and learn from it, because it is through mutual exchange and collaboration that I guess both economies and their respective companies and individual citizens can then derive the resources and the ammunition they need to improve the understanding of, the grasp of, and also the regulation of AI. And just finally, one very quick point, which concerns really how AI trains in the status quo using different sets of data. We're seeing an emergence of a data firewall between China and the rest of the world. And a logical corollary or implication here, especially with regards to AI trained in America, is that much of the data that the AI is currently being fed with is likely to reflect data collected from, all corners of the world, barring China. Now, this may not be an issue when applied to pretty innocuous usages like, using AI to program or to determine traffic flows, or to identify potential pockets of the city for urban renewal and redevelopment. Where do you plant trees? Where best to plant trees? But once AI is applied to questions that are likely to involve more foreign or externally oriented decisions, for instance, do I control and how should I identify, who's a rogue ship and who isn't a rogue ship in the open seas? using AI to optimize sea routes and also trade routes, for instance, through the South China Seas, the East Seas, and the Japan Sea, so on and so forth. We can easily anticipate contexts where the data that's being fed into the AI is, unfortunately, in virtue of the echo chamber from which it's drawn, going to indirectly lead to potentially dangerous behaviors that are antithetical to the interests of the other, whether it be Chinese AI targeting American citizens and American data trained AI targeting Chinese citizens. So what can we do then, right? This is why coordination is so important. This is why both sides need to talk as opposed to not engage in dialogue, not engage in discussions that are very much necessary, even if unpleasant. Sure, talking with the other side may be an uncomfortable experience, but it's a necessary experience for which all hands must be on deck. So that's my take on the AI question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think of course, AI can be applied to many, good aspects. But I think, Brian, you are basically talking about, if you think about, the last Cold War, basically it's all about nuclear, right? How many missiles you have, and then let's compete. Let's have a content. Let's compete. But I think the future war scenario, will be more AI driven. I think the impact, could be more disastrous, than just drop some bombs. Hope that will never happen. But I heard that you also mentioned the term you call the word. I think currently you already feel like we are in a so-called post globalization era. I think this might be debatable. I think we still have some believers in globalization. You just can't believe how fast the world has changed. I think even back to my time at Yale, like about a decade ago, we still have a lot of scholars try to advocating for globalization, right? And I think the former presidents, like from Clinton to Obama, they are pretty much globalization, big fans for globalization, right? So what happened to globalization? I remember Maurice Chung, the founder for TSMC. He just declared that globalization is dead. And he kind of also blamed the U.S., right? This is also very much about geopolitics. Supply chain is also part of geopolitics, right? Maybe you can help us to get a little bit deeper into it, to see where is globalization dead, or what does post globalization really means?
No, thank you very much, George. Look, to be more precise, I didn't intend to say that globalization is dead, simpliciter. I was more suggesting that globalization as we knew it in a sort of post-Cold War, golden 30 years of unbridled globalization and also cross-regional, cross-continental interconnectivity, that era might well be transitioning into a different modus operandi of globalization, or a different paradigm of globalization. And if I could draw upon some of the more buzzword-laden pieces I've written in the past, I made the argument for peace for a China-based think tank, that essentially what we're seeing here is a shift of the world from this sort of unbridled globalization with ups and downs towards a more regionalized globalization. Okay, so a form of regionalized globalization that features, broadly speaking, more balkanization and fragmentation between different regional blocks, but also more consolidation and more integration, opening up selectively, and also taking in migrants, taking in labor and talent selectively within regions. So if you look at inter-ASEAN unity and migrant flows and capital flows, sure, COVID certainly threw a spanner in the works there, but at the end of the day, ASEAN is becoming a more united, slowly and steadily entity. And similarly, looking at America, for instance, where its largest trade partners are no longer China, but are in fact on the Americas, with Mexico taking a surprising top seat recently. It wouldn't be surprising for those who've been tracking trade flows and the rerouting of it since Trump's disastrous trade war. But those who know would know that ultimately the Americas have again become a greater and more tightly knit trading bloc in the aftermath of the pandemic. So I don't want to give off the impression that I think globalization is done. It's cooked. Instead, I'm just suggesting that it's metamorphosizing into a different form, and it's imperative that we recognize that, as opposed to living in a sort of la 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 narrative that all is well after the pandemic. countries and regions opening up, and therefore we're going to be back to being friends with one another. That's not how the world today, unfortunately, is going to work. With that said, two quick comments here. And the first comment is essentially in understanding, what happens to, or what is going on with global geopolitics. We must first look towards domestic politics. And if we look at what's occurred in advanced liberal democracies over the past 6 to 7 years, Brexit in the UK, Donald Trump was elected in the US, the rise of Geert Wilders, Marine Le Pen, respectively, in some of the leading European economies. Now we've got, in a seat of the premiership in Italy, Meloni, who's also a populist, but she was building off really the Five-Star Party and years on end, really, of the populist search, first from the left and then the right in Italy. So if there's one thing that we can say in common about all of these advanced democracies, so to speak, it's that those who have lost out from a combination of globalization, mechanization, as well as skewed economic structures favoring high-end services at the expense of the manufacturing sectors, those who have been left behind have sought to come back, for vengeance. And it is understandable. I don't want to sort of say this in a derogative manner, because it's not. Many of the folks living in the Rust Belt, the blue-collar, white, Anglo-Christian man, who's just lost his job and has not been able to find a job due to hysteresis and also changing economic structures, they have a right to feel aggrieved. It is not their fault, per se, that the economy has changed and the elite have forgotten about them. But what unfortunately has played out for them and also the rest of the world is that their rage, their incandescent rage, fueled the rise of a generation of politicians that pretended to be ostensibly anti-establishment and yet were in fact members of the establishment themselves. I mean, Donald Trump, Nigel Farage, Jacob Rees-Mogg, all of them were partaking and beneficiaries that had profited off the establishment in the past, Boris Johnson as well. And yet for them, they realized that the secret recipe for them to hold on to power is to stoke xenophobia, is to push for isolationism, is advanced selective decoupling and a rerouting of jobs such that ultimately it was the originals, the so-called natives, who would benefit from their efforts. It didn't matter if their efforts had actually succeeded. It didn't matter if Donald Trump, in fact, delivered upon the wall. He didn't. But what did matter was they were in power. And their rising to power most certainly catalyzed a trend that had already started, really, in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, which was essentially a push towards more emphasis upon the local, upon the nation, upon the domestic, upon those who were on the inside as opposed to the outside. And that was when economic and also political nationalism began to surge, the early 2010s, and thus explained really a lot of the more bizarre events, in the eyes of those who are not perhaps trained. They would find them very bizarre. Why would Britain vote for, basically quitting a bloc that had enriched it by and large, especially the poorer nations and parts of Britain, over the past 2 decades or decade and a bit? Why would folks in the United States vote for a president who, as it turned out, would violate constitutional constraints and seek to overturn a democratic election, right? This is something that we must bear in mind, that domestic politics, spurred by the outcomes of globalization, mechanization, and also smorgasbord of other factors, contributed towards geopolitical instability and uncertainty. So that is the first comment when it comes to what happened with globalization. And the second comment, of course, is that the more questionable practices and more questionable decision-making heuristics of leaders that we last saw in the 20th century, mid-20th century or prior to that, the kind of sort of irredentist, conquest-oriented, defensive imperialism that led to World War I and World War II. It made a comeback. It made a strong comeback in certain political leaders in the world. I'm not going to name them explicitly, but I will just say that it was the desire to expand and a desire for them to establish their own domestic political legacy that led them to initiate invasions and military encroachments for which their country is unable to pay the price and their people is suffering and bearing the brunt of, ultimately. And as a result of the rise of militarism, this defensive sense of militarization, arming up countries, turning them into, battlefields, so to speak, what we're seeing over the past 2 to 3 years is the rise of kinetic warfare and hot warfare, that has disrupted supply chains, led to sanctions and counter-sanctions, and forced countries to take sides even when they shouldn't, and clearly don't want to take sides. The net outcome, of course, then, is this realization that because of so-called national security considerations, it is vital for countries to have access to their own strategic supply chains, own strategic raw materials, right? And that's also why America's chatting about shifting TSMC, or rather building a TSMC plant in Arizona, I believe. I mean, good luck to America with that. I'm not convinced it's going to work out, but never say never. Just as, for instance, when the CHIPS Act was passed, it was expected that would purportedly cripple China's ability to produce, chips of its own. And yet, just a few weeks ago, we saw with a Huawei Mate, and also China's ability to produce seemingly sustainably at 14 nm, that it's managed to overcome many of the hurdles that were slapped upon it. So we shall see what's going to come out of the upcoming semiconductor bill, the second one proposed by the Congress. But that's sort of essentially a topic for another question. But yes, so these are my thoughts on globalization and the undoing of it. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned TSMC's plan to now set up the plant in Arizona. I understand from my Taiwanese friends, the progress was I won't say stuck, but there are a lot of challenges, and they also faced a lot of oppositions from the local unions. As you said, maybe initially the Biden administration thought this is purely FDI, right? You got the plant to set up, and then you realize that it's actually also about immigration, technology transfer. So things are getting more and more complicated. And you also mentioned the Huawei. Which phone do you use, Brian?
Full disclosure, I use Samsung. I do like the ringtone. I find it very rejuvenating. Whenever I listen to it, I feel elated. So it's great music.
Right. I think the Huawei case, the new Mate Pro launch, is also a very interesting case, to look into in terms of globalization. The Americans thought, with all the sanctions, Huawei's chip making must be dead, but somehow. It's not like the same generation of Apple's chip technology, but still, it was a surprise for a lot of especially for the politicians in the U.S. That's another story. By the way, I want to say our staff at the Yale Center Beijing also helped to select collect and select some questions from the members and the audience. The globalization question is also one of the top questions coming. I'm not going to naming everyone, but there's I think the name is Siwen coming from Chengdu Normal University, and there were some other friends who asked the same questions. So those who got picked, you will get a small gift. I'm pretty sure Carol's team will take up the logistics. So I'll have one more question, but hopefully, I think people online, if you can just type your question in the chat box, we can see, and then we can also pick up questions from live, to ask Brian. My sort of not my last question, but from my part, then we should open to the floor. Please, in the meantime, please, do type a question in the chat box so we can see. Is of course what happened just over the past few days in Israel, in Gaza. It feels like a very far away, right? How many times we will see a story in in the Chinese media, right? The top headlines will be about Middle East, but there are growing discussions and concerns about how the whole Israel situation will affect, more, make geopolitics even more tricky, right? We already got Ukraine, and now you got Israel, and we don't even know whether Iran will be dragged into a broaden the conflicts or not.
Doesn't seem so right maybe now in terms of intelligence when it comes to Iran.
Right?
Iran was involved or Tehran was in a no. I don't think so.
Right, it will be unthinkable, unimaginable, if Iran and Syria, all got, dragged into. But, Brian, you can also share your views, on how you view, particularly, that, especially in the context of Beijing, more like the Eastern Asian part of geopolitics. What's your view? What's your take on the Israel situation? How will that affect U.S. China relations? Right. Here's my bet. I think President Xi will go to APEC to shake hands with President Biden.
I share your prediction. I agree with you. Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, that will be good news, for the world. Otherwise, people will guess what's going on. But so when the two leaders meet together, will the Israel situation, becomes a little bit, a kind of a new challenge for U.S. China relations? We already have the Ukraine situation to deal with, right? Here, Brian, yeah. I already saw questions, other questions coming in. Feel free to type in the chat box. But Brian, you can address the Israel issue first.
So what I was going to say is, the situation in Israel right now does actually feel quite personal to me. Not because I know anyone directly involved, because some of my very good friends have had families and friends who are abducted by Hamas or Hamas affiliates on the earlier days of this week. So it's been a very difficult week for some of my friends in Israel. And it's obviously been a very difficult week for the innocent people of both Palestine and Israel, who have been instrumentalized and turned into tools, weapons, casualties, collateral damage by politicians, political leaders, so on and so forth. So I genuinely think that we need to, take. I would personally take this moment to say I just hope that the conflict can be resolved soon, but I do not think it will. Okay, so I'll be frank. I do not think this conflict will cease. What we're seeing from Israel, the talk in Israel that I'm hearing right now is that this is their version of 9/11. And Bibi Netanyahu has formed his own unity government with Benny Gantz and other members of the opposition, and a consensus across the spectrum in Israel, which is kind of rare, but also to be expected, is that they must and will indeed retaliate. So I could only posit that I'm not convinced there's a clear and concrete plan for action as to what exactly such retaliation would constitute or involve. But then again, to be fair, these are extraordinary circumstances. So that's just my sort of high level and initial thought in response to your question. With that said, there are 2 to 3 points I'd like to make on this issue, and I'll finally tie them to Sino-US relations before addressing some of the floor questions there. The first is that it is apparent that at least certain segments of the Hamas leadership were unnerved by the recent moves in the Arabic world and also the Middle East, where through whether it be the normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, or indeed the expansion and prospective expansion of the Abraham Accords, which would almost all but certain, at least on a symbolic and principle level, draw Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the rest of the signatories to the agreement closer together. So there's a real sense of, a threat and also perceived jeopardization of the status and bargaining power. None of this justifies at all what Hamas did, but I'm just trying to make sense of the rationale behind what is increasingly seeming to be a Hamas-initiated, as opposed to Tehran-commanded and instructed rogue attack on innocent Israeli civilians. So that's the first quick comment. Secondly, if we look at the actual sort of hands and resources of America right now, I'd say America is pretty overstretched, right? You've got congressmen, mostly in the Republican Party, namely those who had just managed to spectacularly overthrow their own speaker alongside the Democrats. You've got Republicans calling for a reduction in American aid to Ukraine. You're also seeing more isolationist voices from both sides of the aisle in America, advocating the view that America should pull back from its military presence abroad. And now you've got this, really difficult and treacherous situation going on in Israel. And frankly, we could argue that the American State Department and also the intelligence establishment and the army is basically fighting a two-pronged and two-battlefront battle. Now, the question is, what does that mean in terms of Sino-US relations? Some would say, well, this is a good thing for Sino-US tensions, because at the very least it means that if the Americans' hands are full, then there's less time for them to provoke and instigate tensions. Also, they think, right? So amongst these folks, they tend to see America as the provocateur and China as being on the defensive. Whereas there's also the other view that because America is so distracted right now, Beijing might seize upon the opportunity to make certain moves that would further complicate that matter. Now, I must say, I do not agree with the second view. I don't see leaders in Beijing right now, and you guys would know better than me because you're on the ground there. I don't see leaders in Beijing right now as wanting to open up another battlefront, another sort of front on which they'd be in an antagonistic relationship with the US. In fact, if we look at the recent trips, the slew of visits for American businessmen and cabinet officials, and also just recently, the Senate majority, the leader, Chuck Schumer, it's clear to me that Beijing is in a mood and is looking for opportunities to, if possible, lower the temperature in a room. So I do not buy that line of argument. But whereas for the other view that, Sino-American relations would therefore improve because America needs to focus on Israel and Palestine, I'm also not convinced by that either, because ultimately what we're seeing coming from America today in relation to China is this growing consensus that China is a competitor, is a strategic rival. And where there is, and there are differences, across the board between, say, more hawkish and neoconservative individuals and, say, you've got them on one end, actually not one end. The furthest end are those ideological zealots, right, who have religious or Catholic or whatever they call it reasons to just systemically want to annihilate and dismantle China and to, turn China back into what it was 60 years ago. And then you've got the neocons and the military defense hawks, the security hawks, perhaps best epitomized by Gallagher, whereas the extreme end is perhaps personified by Mike Pompeo. So you've got Pompeo, you've got Gallagher, and you've got a bunch of, previously pretty pro-engagement, increasingly disillusioned skeptics, the likes of, say, Bonnie Glaser, Orville Schell, and maybe, some would say they could put Jake Sullivan in that basket. And then further to the end of being more pro-engagement, you've got the old guard and old voices, who say that you must engage China because firstly, we like China, or secondly, we like doing business with China, or thirdly, because they genuinely do not see, the kind of antagonistic rhetoric launched towards China as productive. This is the spectrum that we see in America today, but the Overton window is predominantly clustered around, and wedged between those who are saying, China is probably someone or some entity we ought to be cautious about, and those who say, let's destroy the country altogether. So in short, there's not much room for pro-engagement, constructive dialogue, at least on a US side. If anything, I do think that, the Chinese MFA and also the foreign policy community in China have been more receptive towards dialogue in principle, even though in practice, of course, with the recent sort of, curbing or the restrictions concerning meetings and visits of foreigners and meetings with foreigners and limits to the channels of communication, including restrictions on certain folks leaving the country, it's been in practice much harder for people in China to conduct track-to dialogues with their counterparts abroad. But by and large, I'd say there's more appetite for dialogue from China than in the US or from the US, so to speak. So in any case, all of this is to say one, broad point that the dynamics of Sino-US interactions will not hinge much, if at all, on the trajectory of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And with that, I think we have time to look at the questions on the floor now. So thank you for that question, George.
Yeah, no, I also feel like one point you make, any crisis could be also an opportunity. I think U.S. still has some expectation on China, to be a responsible, big nation, to take up, some responsibilities. I remember, a lot of people compared, what happened in Israel, with 9/11 in the U.S., right? But you remember, when 9/11 happened, President Jiang Zemin was one of the first state, heads, to give, George W. Bush a call, right, to send the condolence and show support, for the war on terrorism. That made a very significant impact on the U.S.-China relations. So this is also a moment, if not an opportunity, perhaps, for Beijing to, think a bit, about, the new approach in terms of, foreign policy. We saw a lot of, I love our audience, it's very active flow of questions. I don't think we can address all the questions, but Brian, maybe we can find a way, in text or something, we can get to the Yale Beijing center staff, to help to follow up. But, maybe we pick up, some mainstream question. For example, what do you think of decoupling? Is decoupling is going to work in for U.S. China, and then some other audience also mentioned, we talk quite a bit about U.S. China, right? It sounds
Yes.
like the whole world is like G2. Do we still have some hope, for multi-polar, world, or what? Again, back to my question at the
Yeah.
beginning. What about those small countries?
Yeah. So thank you. I'm going to answer a lot of the questions sort of semi-consecutively. So it's going to be around 7 minutes of me answering these questions one by one-ish. And then George, you tell me, Carol, you tell me if I'm answering them right. So firstly, I don't think decoupling, I think selective decoupling is already happening, right? So decoupling in strategically sensitive sectors, in sectors where national security and also
industry
comparative
focused
advantages in industries, may well be involved. We look at the EU proposal concerning de-risking, right? Quantum computing, AI, semiconductors and biotech. So these are areas where even EU is seeking de-risking and selective decoupling from China. And let's face it, de-risking is just selective decoupling, but it's like very selective or somewhat selective. Who knows? Secondly, Gina Raimondo's visit to China attests to the fact that the US is keen on preserving, trade ties and business ties in non-sensitive sectors. And that sort of will and that verdict is very much reciprocated by the likes of, say, Wang Wentao, Liu He, so on and so forth in China. You've got a Minister for Commerce and also Cai Ban Zhuren, who's still not stepped down. And hopefully Liu He will stay on for more, because Liu He is a true voice of reason and pragmatism. Multipolarity, look, I also want to believe that we live in a multipolar world. I certainly do believe we are trending towards multipolarity, but I do not for a second believe that this is a multipolar world just yet, because at the end of the day, there are very few other powers, not Japan, not the EU, even if you would account it as a collective entity and a homogenous entity, which it clearly isn't, or ASEAN or Russia. None of these could come close to China and America in terms of economic heft, strategic influence, and also the role they play in multilateral and international governmental institutions. And in any case, Japan is perhaps too proximate to the US in terms of foreign policy position for it to count as a separate pole, although I'm willing to be convinced otherwise, of the contrary. I would also flag that just because we are living in a bipolar world doesn't mean that regional poles and centers don't matter. In fact, I'm a firm believer in the importance and the prowess of small and medium powers. I mean, the medium power diplomacy by the likes of, say, Turkey, Kazakhstan, Indonesia, which is growing to be a regionally significant and sizable power, Mexico, South Africa to a lesser extent, Brazil. These are all countries I would flag as being worthy of consideration as important stakeholders and actors, even though they're not at the same level as China and the US just yet. And of course, there's the classic Russia. And Russia's not going anywhere, much to the chagrin of some and perhaps to the consolation of others. So that's my thought on Henry's question. Rising populism, right-wing populism, so to speak, is, I certainly think that the peak, the past wave of right-wing populism might have peaked. And I think it peaked probably with Donald J. Trump getting voted out of office, even though he clamored to try and return to his office. Ever since then, we've seen really the rise and restoration of more sensible and broadly centrist politicians across a majority of advanced liberal democracies, even the UK, which was for a short while the sort of bastion of right-wing, posh, standoffish politics, as epitomized by Boris Johnson's brand of populism, has now, thankfully, due to Liz Truss's completely catastrophic, beaten by a lettuce tenure, the UK is now once again in the hands of someone that you may not find particularly charismatic, but is ultimately a trained and broadly qualified soft Tory who's culturally conservative, but by no means economically out of this world in a wrong way or outlandish. So I think Rishi Sunak should be given credit where credit's due, so to speak. Why does the US need to work with China in AI, and how can that happen? So answering Henry and Yang. Two quick thoughts here. I think they must work with one another, not because they're friends or because they like one another, because they have no choice, because of the devastating implications and the consequences were they to not work together. If we take a look at the US and the USSR during the Cold War, both powers clearly did not see eye to eye. They didn't have much time for one another. They didn't think, very highly of one another. And in fact, we could argue that they were really more of mortal enemies than China and US today are. But yet, on the issue of nuclear non-proliferation, they saw a need to cooperate. On the issue of, say, ruling or reigning in biochemical weapons or other forms of warfare that could well be devastating and destructive, they saw the need to cooperate. And even on issues like space technologies, where yes, you did have the space war and space rivalry, there was an agreement not to turn the outer space into, you know, a de facto proxy battlefield. So even in the case of the US and USSR, these antagonistic rival powers could come to an agreement. So why is that not possible when it comes to China and the US, right? Given that China and the US are by no means, despite all the talk, I believe, as of today, you know, at the same level of vitriol and mutual antagonism as the USSR and the US were during the Cold War. And to the extent that that's something that we accept, then, you know, how should researchers work together? Well, this is something I'm working on. I really want to issue this as an open petition and call for suggestions and help from everyone in the room. I'm a firm belief that ultimately the future of Sino-US relations, as President Xi very, you know, he was right on the money. He was incredibly, you know, on point in saying that the future of Sino relations rests with the people. 就是中美关系的希望就是在于人民的。我是完全同意咱们国家习主席所说。He's right, and that's why humbly, you know, with all due respect, whilst governments and bureaucrats and technocrats are great, if we can't cut through the red tape, let's start with the people. Let's get the people to work together first. Scientists, academics, private sector representatives, leaders, thought leaders. Let's find a platform in a space where we can have intelligent and mutually respectful discussions, no matter, and whether it be if Donald Trump were to regain the White House, okay, to answer Thao's question, or if Biden were to stay on for a second term, or Ron DeSantis were to enter into the White House. And this also allows me to tie my answers to Sebastian's question concerning Hong Kong. You know, where else to advance? Where else can we advance Sino-American AI cooperation than on the soil of the most open, most progressive, and most cosmopolitan and unique city in China, Hong Kong SAR? To me, Hong Kong is the site for Sino-American cooperation over AI, trade, finance, law, bio hazards, and also pandemics. But it's also a site where China can work with other, you know, members of the international community. And that is why I'm a firm believer and a fervent advocate that Hong Kong must become a site for Hong Kong, for Sino-ASEAN synergy, that China and ASEAN have more to gain from working together and even more closely through the unique cosmopolis that is Hong Kong. But the prerequisite for that, of course, is that Hong Kong needs to stay special and needs to stay unique. And even in areas like climate change, we've got folks like Christine Lowe and Ma Jun spearheading climate finance. I know, Max Song, you do a lot of work on that front as well, whether it be in carbon trading and ESG finance and compliance, in, you know, disclosure requirements concerning scopes 1, 2, 3 emissions. These are all areas where Hong Kong has the knowledge lead and the comparative advantage. So the key question here is, can we get John Kerry and Xie Zhenhua, for instance, Xie Dashi, to meet in Hong Kong? I hope we can facilitate that, because that frankly would be a demonstration of our enduring strength as a beautifully open city, as a city where 7.5 million people are not just the people of Hong Kong, they are also denizens of China. 他们都是中国的一部分，他们都是这个中国现代化过程的一部分。And to the extent that we can make it happen in Hong Kong, I'd be very glad and happy to work with George, to work with Carol, to work hopefully with all of you in making Hong Kong, you know, once again, a place about which we can be proud. Because Hong Kong, whether or not Hong Kong is back, whether or not Hong Kong is here, whether or not Hong Kong is on the world stage, it doesn't depend on, nor should it be contingent upon the whims of some folks sitting in White House, in Congress, on Capitol Hill. I say otherwise. I say the future of Hong Kong rests with you and me, rests with all of us, not with those who want to see it marginalized, who believe that it should be consigned to the dustbins of history, but instead it lies with those in the private sector, in academia, in the business world, but also in our governments, our civil service and the cabinet in Hong Kong today. If we can work together to say internationalization is the only path for Hong Kong, and that reform is the only means of driving our city to progress, once we accept that and implement that, then I would not be too worried about those who want to marginalize Hong Kong, because there's nothing that they could do to stop us from being the city that we can all be proud of once again. So thank you very much for that. Thank you all.
Thanks, Brian. I think, you know, we can tell you're very passionate about Hong Kong. You know, I know, you know, this is also exactly why, you know, took the HKU offer. Even I know you are in hot demand. You can go elsewhere. But you choose to return to Hong Kong. To start your academic career at HKU. I personally very much respect that. And on the people to people diplomacy relationship, I think Yale is also a great example. I have to say, Carol knows the story. Yale got the first Chinese students, to graduate. And then fast forward, and now we have the Yale Center in Beijing. Of course, between the two events, there are so many things happened, right? And not always on the happy terms, for U.S. and China. But we, the history can tell, you still, go through, not to mention, we also got the Yali 协会, one of the first, like, sort of, foreign back to NGOs. Now they are doing the great work. I saw Burns, Ambassador Burns also went there. Recently to pay a visit. That's great example. He, as the ambassador, also tried very hard, to under the history, the legacy, the connections between the two countries, to see beyond the all the challenges, problems. So I don't want to end the book talk, the live chat, with like, oh, Jesus, the world is just G2, But I think there are still a lot of hope. We have a lot of people working on the the most important bilateral relationship in the world, which also matters for many other countries, for the rest of the world. Thanks again, Carol, for the opportunity for us to host Brian, for to give us a briefing on geopolitics from his book. We really look forward to catching up, following up in future opportunities.
Absolutely.
Thank
You
you
so much, Brian, for your very passionate sharing, to George for your very capable moderating. We got to continue this. We got to continue these conversations to soldier on, keep these conversations going, scientific and academic collaborations. I want to say to all of our audiences that for all our Yale Center Beijing Zoom talks, we have a little ritual at the end where we would like to invite all of you who are able to switch on your cameras so that we can have a little group shot with our distinguished speakers, if you can. I would also like to say, I would like to give a little preview of George's upcoming event on November 16th, again with us on understanding U.S. China relations in the context of technology and digital trade. And for those of you who are lucky ones who are located in Beijing, George will come in person. And I would like to also extend an open invitation to Brian that whenever you come up north to Beijing, that you are more than welcome to come do a talk. And I'm sure our audiences would be so thrilled to interact with you.